In this episode of S&C Critical Insights, Marc Treviño and Melissa Sawyer, co-heads of S&C's corporate governance practice, and special counsel June Hugh, continue to analyze significant trends and developments that emerged from the recent U.S. annual meeting proxy season and provide takeaways for 2025.
So let's talk about social and political proposals. The story here is basically the opposite of what Marc just recited for governance proposals. So whereas we saw an increase in governance proposals this year, we actually saw that social and political proposals plateaued after increasing a lot in previous years. Now they're kind of holding steady. Whereas the number of governance proposals that actually go to a vote decreased, for social and political proposals, we saw an increase in the number of voted proposals. And we saw this have the greatest impact in the financial sector, which I thought was just kind of an interesting data point, where the number of voted proposals that were social and political proposals increased by 57% compared to last year. So that was a big increase. And then lastly, while we saw shareholder support for governance proposals increase, the shareholder support for social and political proposals continued to decrease. And that was especially true for certain so-called hot topics like diversity and human capital management. Just recapping some of these trends, diversity proposals are receiving lower support in the wake of the Harvard decision. I think in part this is attributable to some investors taking more of a wait and see approach about what companies can and can't do. And there's also a lot of political pressure around this topic at the moment. We saw more submissions of labor and human capital management proposals, but less support for those. So there are more coming in and shareholders are not voting for them. The emerging focus on AI, that's a trend that we think could pick up in next year's proxy season. So it's definitely one to watch. Again, that's mostly happening at the largest companies. We saw an increase in the number of business human rights proposals. This goes to things like requesting audits of companies' human rights policies and impacts, or focusing on supply chain child labor issues. And in general, companies were less willing to settle these types of proposals to secure a withdrawal. So these were going on to the proxy. The last point on here is one that I think is very interesting and we haven't talked about yet, so I'll just spend a minute on it. But political spending and lobbying proposals are one of the most prevalent categories of proposals year after year. The trend that we have observed is that in presidential election years, the number of these submissions drop, but then it picks up again in years for midterm elections. So we saw them drop this year. In 2 years, they'll probably pick up again. So prepare yourselves, because I don't think that these are going away anytime soon. And with that, I'll turn it over to June to talk about environmental proposals, which is a very interesting category.
I would say that the environmental trends this year were very similar to those in social. In 2021, around the time that the SEC opened its request for information to create a set of climate disclosure rules, environmental proposals jumped both in terms of total number and in terms of support, and reached a high of 41% in terms of support for voted proposals. This year, I think instead of seeing any kind of continued momentum, we really saw shareholders approach environmental proposals, especially climate proposals, with a lot more caution. And part of the story is on the companies themselves. They're increasingly subject to regulatory requirements, including the SEC's final climate rules, which were adopted in March of this year, and then a few weeks later stayed by the SEC after many states and business groups sued to challenge those rules. There were rules adopted in California this proxy season, and the European reporting requirements will come online for some companies beginning a few months in 2025. So I think against that backdrop of climate issues moving from kind of a voluntary patchwork to a regulated framework, we saw companies approach proposals with caution. We saw shareholders, when they were voting on these proposals, being more cautious as well. And part of that has to do with the quote anti-ESG backlash that we've been seeing intensify over the last few years. This proxy season, the significant exit of members of Climate Action 100 Plus, which is an investor group that had previously targeted large companies in the oil and gas industry to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions through a series of corporate actions. We saw proposals in the energy utility sector go down. This year, that sector received about 14% of environmental proposals, whereas in prior years, we saw 30% or more of environmental proposals submitted being concentrated in that sector. In terms of the no action story, we actually saw pretty good success from companies this year in getting proposals, especially granular, really prescriptive proposals, excluded through the no action process and on experimental topics like biodiversity, nature, and things that are kind of just emerging onto the scene. We also saw proponents being willing to withdraw proposals, resulting in only about 50% of environmental proposals submitted reaching the ballot, which is the lowest voting rate across all of the categories. The average support has kind of a similar story to the social proposals. If you separate the anti-ESG voting, the numbers actually held pretty similar. And then there were a couple of areas where, depending on how the shareholder approached the proposal, the voting results were dramatically different. And the first of these areas is in the climate disclosure, climate targeting area. We saw the proposals that were popular in prior years, meaning a kind of one-size-fits-all approach for companies to reduce scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. We saw that proposal not really doing very well at the polls. So when it was a proposal with a scope 3 mandate to disclose or to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we saw around 20% lower support for that proposal as compared to a more tailored proposal saying, please tell us about your scope 1 and scope 2 reporting. And I think part of that approach is reflected in the ultimate version of the SEC climate proposal. The SEC ultimately decided in its final climate rules not to include scope 3 in what it would require companies to disclose, focusing instead on scope 1 and 2 emissions if material.
As you sit here now, and you may have a few months before you really have to gear up for next year's proxy season, one thing that you could be doing in this time would be reviewing your bylaws and your meeting procedures to make sure that they all make sense and that your proxy disclosures make sense in the event that somebody comes at you with one of these new strategies, like making floor proposals, for example, because these are things that I think a lot of companies haven't had to worry about to date. But now that we're starting to see this happen, it makes sense to be prepared so that you're not scrambling at your meeting to deal with it. So that's my recommendation for next year. June?
My recommendation is to do a Google search of one name if you haven't heard of it already, and it's Robbie Starbuck. In the weeks really after the core proxy season ended, targeting Ford, Harley Davidson, Lowe's, making these kind of catchy social media posts, calling up members of the board of directors, telling them either on social media or through these private engagements to replace their CEOs, and getting information leaked through employees that many companies consider confidential internal documents. You should really make sure your communication strategy takes into account social media engagement, that you're monitoring unusual social media activity, and that your board has really a one voice policy when it comes to these types of engagements.
Look, my final takeaway on this is around director qualifications, and we've seen a real push on it, including with a buy-in as to specific director qualifications being tied to specific success or risk factors the disclosure of those qualifications in a matrix format, which I will point out makes it more easily machine digestible. And it is part of the business model of the proxy advisory firms to use that type of information in a black box type way to then generate voting recommendations. And we see that most profoundly on the equity plans. And you see it also in the compensation area. And it wouldn't surprise me, given all of the disclosure that we have now around directors and their history and qualifications, that you wouldn't begin to see a more automated version of recommendations around that, which I worry about. So that is my takeaway from 2024, and I wish you the best for the coming season. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to S&C Critical Insights. For more information about our practice, please visit us on the web at www.solcrom.com.